This is Dan, and you're watching The Salty Sea. I'm here with the first follow-up, hopefully of many, to the starter lists for Warcry video series that I made. And this time I'm going to be putting all of the budget lists into a tier list. The idea here is to find you the very best warbands in the game that you can get for just real cheap. Hopefully this is going to be a really good resource for, new players or even people who aren't that new but just want to, expand into Warcry pretty quickly and easily. Um, so again, I'm going to be using the budget lists from each of my starter lists series for each faction in the game. The only one that didn't get a budget list is Lumineth because they cost $1 million per model. Now, any kind of discussion of any sort of tier list in Warcry would be remiss without mentioning Reedo. You're probably familiar with his channel if you found this one, but just in case you aren't, he really put a ton of work into, he was the first person to start really making tier lists for Warcry. Ton of engagement over there. I really think you should check out his latest one, which just dropped a couple days ago, actually. Um, then following up to this, I'm going to be releasing a math video, and we'll do something fun for a casual tier list too. But for now, let's get into the lowest tiers of the budget part of the game. Now, there's a bunch of top tier warbands on this list that they just happen to be really expensive to collect. So for example, Daughters of Cain, you can make something really powerful out of it, but the Start Collecting box, you get some really good fighters, but you don't get a warband that sort of plays to all the mechanics of the game. I'll be able to show you a little bit more on that later. Same with Stormcast Vanguard. You don't have any sort of birds, or at least not a lot of birds in the budget list. Um, you know, the only way to get them is to get a bunch of Vanguard Raptors, which you end up not using for Warcry. So much easier to play that faction if you already play Stormcast. Um, Otherwise, you'll also notice, a couple options here. Tzeentch and KO, they've got just slightly more expensive options that'll function a little bit better. And then otherwise, you see just a lot of the usual suspects for some of the weaker factions in the game. Some of them, have some movement problems. Sometimes it's a bit of damage problems. So, for example, Nighthaunt move around the board pretty well. They just pay for it in quite a bit in terms of their points. But let's get into the exciting part, and that's the fat middle of Warcry. The B and C tier here are incredibly crowded, and I really think that's a good thing. It means you can just play a ton of different war bands that are pretty close to each other. I think this is, everything that we're looking for the game there. I do want to call out Bone Splitters. I owe them a bit of an apology. I'll make a separate video just for that. But they're doing just fine in this middle tier list, even though I spent plenty of time complaining about the one box Bone Splitter list not being very good. Turns out, once I actually started digging really into them relative to all the other cheap factions, they do just fine. Um, Another thing you're going to notice with these C tier warbands is, Stormcast, they do often struggle in this game, at least when you're just looking at the base, big armored troops. And so you'll see Gryph-hounds really propping up the Warrior Chamber and the Sacrosanct Chamber. And then, Ogre Maw tribes, I put them at the top of C tier, but I'll show you later on in the video, they really exist on a class of their own. Um, they sort of function really differently than every other warband in these tiers, and part of that's just because, ogres are their own special snowflakes. My one big surprise with B tier, now all of these are really quality warbands that you're getting out of either Start Collecting boxes or what have you, but the fact that Seraphon is not in A tier was a big surprise to me. I'm going to go a little bit more into that in my limitations section, but for now, that's just a curiosity that I found in this group. A second weird one is the Slaanesh Sybarites. Ooh, say that 5 times fast. The Slaanesh Mortals are, thought of as one of the lowest tier warbands in the game. I do still think that that's largely true. However, on a budget, essentially you're just grabbing two, sort of the Dread Pageant plus your favorite box, and if that favorite box is Fiend Bloods, I do think that Slaanesh Fiend Bloods are um, a legitimately great unit that just happens to be in a weaker warband. So you're getting about 99% of the power in all of Slaanesh Sybarites, is also in the budget list. So that's why they're much higher here than you would see them on, say, a competitive tier list. So let's jump into the very top. Now, I started this really hoping that Skaven wouldn't be number one. After all, they're number one on most people's top warbands in the entire game lists. So I was hoping, when you're playing on a budget, playing just starting off with your friends, are Skaven still going to be the top? And yes, they are. That box of Plague Monks that you can get for just, I think, like $38 US. Ooh, that is a wicked way to play in the game. Then you'll see there's sort of two other ways that warbands tend to dominate at this top level. And so Flesh Eater Courts and Ideneth Deepkin, they both have really great start collecting boxes that give you everything you need to play. And that just makes them incredibly powerful if you're just looking to grab one box and get into Warcry. Those are both options that you can absolutely, take to a tournament. Um, then Slaves to Darkness and Slaanesh Demons, they mostly rely on the fact that their chaff models are really strong. Most people aren't quite as high on Marauders as I am, but I don't think I've ever met anyone who wasn't at least impressed with them. Um, move 4, but range 3 just totally makes up for the slower movement, letting you put these incredible bubbles of influence all around the board. You can pick up a box of Marauders plus a Slaves to Darkness hero for super cheap and just have a warband that's spamming a massive amount of reasonable damage troops all over the board. Um, Slaanesh are a little similar. My budget list for those was Demonettes and Seekers, and those are both pretty cheap boxes, which is great. And then Demonettes, they have move 5, they do a ton of damage. They have access to an ability that pumps up their damage significantly more than Onslaught would, which is extremely rare in this game and just great for them to have. And then Seekers, I don't run Seekers in a more competitive Slaanesh Demons list, but they just barely don't make the cut. They're great models, and so, if you run an all Demonettes and Seekers list, you're going to probably have a lot of success. I would say anything in the S or A tier here is something that you could absolutely just take to a tournament and feel perfectly fine, even against sort of fully tuned up, fully expensive lists. Um, you're not going to feel like you have any kind of disadvantage there. And I think that's a real positive. If that's what you're looking for, I think it's a real positive that you have 5 good options for it. Some of the fact of tier A having the smallest number, I found pretty big drop-offs. The first one being between Flesh Eater Courts and Ideneth Deepkin, the second between Deepkin and Slaanesh, and then between Slaanesh and Beasts of Chaos. Things start to really crunch together in terms of my rating system once you get to Beasts of Chaos. So I'll move on to that soon, but just wanted to note here that, that's why tier A is, by far the smallest of them, is because that seems to be where that stratification tends to be. Um, but one really cool thing about Warcry, and especially Warcry for cheap, is that you see, like what I showed in the tiers, there's really heavy grouping right in the middle. These are the ratings I did, and I'll make a separate video for exactly the maths behind them for anyone who really wants to get in the nerd corner with me. But for now, the main thing I want to show is that there's just a ton of grouping right in the middle, and that you can take really any 2 warbands from this B tier here and just run them up against each other and have a great time. And then you're also going to notice, so a lot of folks will complain um, that the single box Warcry warbands are at a big disadvantage in this game. And you'll see a ton of them are just right here in this balanced tier with, we've got Corvus, Unmade, Cypher Lords, Splintered Fang, all of them just with one box can make for fairly competitive, really fun, powerful lists that are just going to go toe to toe with any kind of quick and dirty Age of Sigmar list that your friends build to go up against you with. So let's talk a little bit about the different ways that that warbands get here. So the way I rated them, we've got kind of two sections here, Tricksy points versus Fighty points. And I'll get into this more in another video, but Fighty points basically being the point for point stat lines of each of the models that make up a warband. Whereas Tricksy points, it's a sort of composite of two different things, one being the abilities and one being how well it plays to the game mechanics of Warcry. And I'll certainly elaborate that on that in a different video. Please, if you're curious and you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and I promise I'll explain more. Um, but what I really find interesting about this sort of scatter plot, now it is a mess where things start to group together, right? You can't read everything since I chose labels instead of dots, but um, labels are more useful for just showing what I wanted to show here, which is that there's pretty clear separation between, this top tier and this second tier. Slaanesh Demons and Idoneth Deepkin are just right on top of each other. But they're all just really far away from all their other buddies here. And then you just see this several just very close together groups that are sort of around. Now you can absolutely grab anything that's sort of next to each other in these groups and, have a great time with it. Um, Maw tribes are a really interesting outlier that makes me think a lot about my rating system because ogres in this game, stat for stat, are just incredible. Um, they're just incredible at just crushing down anything that goes and fights with them. And then Noblars, which are the little ogres, are basically the same. So, my budget ogre list, I think has 2 Noblars and then just a bunch of gluttons with clubs. And it is an absolute beat stick of a warband. So yes, ogres ended up in C tier, but I do think that there's going to be a correlation when you're actually playing these lists of, I think that lists that are sort of more on the fighty spectrum of if you were to draw sort of an imaginary line down the diagonal here, lists that are more on the fighty spectrum, I think are going to be easier to pilot. And so, if you want to just have some beers with some friends and, you guys aren't thinking too hard about strategy, I do think something like Maw Tribes is really going to overperform, and you know, it's probably going to go toe to toe with anything in B and maybe even A tier if you and your opponents aren't really trying to get into the weeds of the strategy of the game. So just real quick, I'll go into some small limitations of, I think, my rating system. I I'm really excited to talk more about it. I absolutely stand by it. Some changes that I might make with future ones. I do think right now I'm overrating models with big drawbacks and big advantages, right? Things that are a 10 on one scale and a 1 on the other. So stuff like move 3 fighters with ridiculous damage output, something like Plague Bearers, or also move 10 fighters that don't do a ton of damage are also, I think, overrated slightly. Now, I do think in the hands of a real master player, I do think that having those really skewed strengths and weaknesses um, can really benefit you a lot in the game, right? If you have multiple things with different roles and they're all incredibly good at their role, uh, you're going to be able to take advantage of that really well if you have a ton of experience. But I do think that, it can be really tough for a newer player with some of these units that have kind of all in on one basket. Also, the Tricksy points score, it does slightly overrate lists with exactly 11 models. Just a tiny amount, not too big a deal, but maybe something I'll try to correct when I do sort of a competitive tier list that's got to be exactly perfect or something. Then I just want to note mobile archers are kind of one of the poster boys of what gets overrated for things that are really good at some things and not that great at others. Things like Wind Chargers, the Night Venator, who the Night Venator is a legitimately incredible unit, or Blissbarb Seekers. Those, you know, get boosted a little bit in the rating system um, for their ability to kind of project anywhere on the board. And I don't think that that power translates to your second one that you take, if that makes sense, right? Your very first Wind Charger in your list is doing a ton for you, right? It's going all over the board, it's getting any kind of treasure or objective, and then it's staying safe while putting damage onto your opponent. However, if you have a bunch of those, all of a sudden the amount of safe places that you can shoot from is going to be far fewer, and also it's going to matter more that the damage that you're putting on isn't quite as much point for point. Then right now also, I think it just barely underrates some of the sort of medium speed melee folks with range 2. Um, Corvus Cabalites, my system actually puts really, really high and does the same for Plague Monks, but I rate them even higher. I think those are two of the very best units in the entire game. And then it also right now underrates things with toughness 2. Right now, basically I made my survivability algorithm to be really, really good at knowing the difference between how much more tanky toughness 3 makes, or toughness 5 makes you than 4, and 4 makes you than 3. But the move from uh, 2 to 3 and the move from 5 to 6 are kind of outside the formula because it's just so rare that you see them. And so I do think it slightly underrates toughness 2, just a little bit. Um, Also, maybe just a tiny bit, uh, having one super elite ability target is rated the same as having a good one, which, these are just tiny differences here, but something I just wanted to throw out there, right? Um, right now it's rating having, say, a Doom Bull. You get more points because Doom Bulls are better than, say, you know, the average leader of a Warcry warband, like a Warcry specific warband. Um, but you don't get extra points on the Tricksy scale for having one big beefer, and I think maybe you could argue that you should. Same is true of having multiple good ones per round. So, for example, the Corvus Cabal um, Shrike Talon, the sort of head honcho who isn't the leader, um, just gets underrated slightly if you take a second one. The second one doesn't get you as many points as the first one does. Um, Not a big deal for this one because there's only one in the box, but just something to notice as I go forward with these and make some changes, and I'll talk to you about the changes and let you know as I manage to solve these limitations here. So there you have it. Hopefully that wasn't going too deep on some of the minutia instead of focusing on the tiers themselves. I'm really excited to be doing this. So let me know if you were surprised at any of the inclusions here. Think anything should be higher or lower. Do make sure that you're keeping in mind that these are just the budget versions of all of these warbands. I'm really excited to talk more and more about the different ways to play the game, and how you can make Warcry be a ton of different games to you. And one of those really is to just sort of jump in with a new warband really quick just to see if you like painting it, and then if you love it, then you can build a whole, you can go build the more competitive version of it, or then if you like that, you can just go create an entire army of it for Age of Sigmar, right? But then Budget Warcry just lets you kind of dip your toe in the water, make a really cheap version of a warband, and just see if you love it. Something like Legions of Nagash, right? If you are seeing all these Soulblight Gravelords things and you're wondering if you want to jump into the army, um, check out my starter list death video where I show you a really cheap budget Legions of Nagash force, and then be, pretty confident that even if you don't love painting it, it'll still be, perfectly balanced in Warcry, right? It's at the top of budget B tier, and that can give you some confidence for testing it out. So I'll be coming in with, more of these, more follow-ups to this in the future. And until then, may all your rolls be crits.